Now that the dust has settled over the general elections in the UK, we can objectively look at whether the Muslim Vote campaign has been successful or not.
The Labour Party has won this general election. I've called Sir Keir Starmer to congratulate him on his victory.
Change begins now.
The exit poll is predicting a Labour landslide.
These numbers are astonishing.
I think we should get the party started.
They have chosen Labour and they have chosen the leadership of Keir Starmer.
To understand this question, we need to understand what are the objectives behind this campaign, because any action should be on the level of the aim. And ultimately, the aim should be to alleviate the suffering faced by the Palestinians. In order to understand the potential of this aim being met, we need to understand what the British political system is and how it operates. Before I explain this, I want to acknowledge that these elections have been unique. Firstly, we saw 14 years of Tory government ended with a landslide victory for Labour. We saw the Reform Party headed by the far-right Nigel Farage win not only 5 seats but also having over 4 million Brits voting for them, their best ever result in their short history. Even Nigel Farage himself won his first parliamentary seat in the UK. But perhaps as equally significant was the unique stance many Muslims took in the UK general elections. Many Muslims have been horrified and united in their condemnation of mainstream politicians and parties who have showed blind fanatical support for Israel. Therefore, a large electorate of Muslims abandoned the mainstream parties in favour of pro-Palestinian independent candidates. Not only did they slash votes in Muslim-populated areas for the Labour candidates, and these were once safe Labour seats, but it also resulted in 5 pro-Palestinian independents winning their seats. But even with these victories and Labour's share of the votes being slashed in Muslim-populated areas, will this actually deliver justice for the people of Gaza? Now, to understand this, we need to quickly refresh our understanding of the British political system. The British political system is split between 2 houses, the House of Commons, which is elected, and the unelected House of Lords. Although in practice the House of Commons is meant to have the mandate to decide laws and policies, the unelected chamber of the House of Lords have the right to veto the House of Commons decisions. Now, there are occasions the House of Commons can bypass the House of Lords, but this is rarely done and can only be done in very special circumstances. The House of Commons have a total of 650 seats, and any party that achieves 326 seats have the right to form their own government. Why is 326 seats important? Well, that's because if any legislation is to be passed, it would need the majority of MPs to vote for it. If then you have the majority of MPs from one political party, barring any rebellions, then they are able to pass their legislation in Parliament. Thus, they have the right to form a government. The Labour won a whopping 411 seats. So in theory, any vote for a Labour motion or policy in the House of Commons will be passed. The 5 pro-Palestinian MPs will not be able to affect this anyway whatsoever. In fact, if every non-Labour MP voted against a Labour motion, they still wouldn't have enough votes to stop a Labour motion from being passed. Now, some may say, but what if some Labour MPs voted against a Labour motion? Well, the parliamentary system has something called a whipping process. Whipping is actually a metaphor. It's basically a way that the party forces its MPs to vote in a particular way. It's effectively a piece of paper with orders on what you should vote for. And depending on whether it's a 3-lined whip, basically meaning it's underlined 3 times, that therefore you'd have to vote for a particular motion. If any MP then defies this whipping process, then this could result from their expulsion from the political party. That means the next general election they would have to stand as an independent. They wouldn't get any of the party support. They wouldn't get any of the funds from their political party to campaign for their campaigns. Why is explaining this important? Because as you can see, to effect policy change as independents are incredibly difficult. Firstly, Labour has 411 out of 650 seats. Secondly, they can force their MPs to vote for a motion through the whipping process. Thirdly, the House of Lords can potentially veto the votes made by the House of Commons. And finally, the majority of the motions being presented to Parliament will be those from the government of the day, in this case, Labour. So the question then becomes, how much of an effect can 5 pro-Palestinians MPs actually make? Could they force Parliament to adopt a ceasefire motion? Could they end arms deals with Israel? Could they end the slaughter being faced by the Palestinians and reverse the occupation not only from 1967 but the occupation of 1948? I think you can see the problem. how the British political system is stacked against the 5 pro-Palestinian independent MPs. Therefore, it's pretty clear that if the aim is to gain enough votes to have a significant effect on the potential votes in the House of Commons, then the Muslim Vote campaign woefully fell short of achieving this aim. And remember, this isn't necessarily about getting hundreds of MPs. In many cases, votes can be close, particularly if the government has a small majority. In that case, 20 or 30 MPs could sway a particular vote. But in this case, Labour have a massive majority and the 5 MPs are too small in number to be considered significant. But some Muslims who supported the Muslim Vote campaign will say this wasn't about gaining control over Parliament or having a significant number of MPs to affect legislation. Rather, this was about sending a message, particularly to the Labour Party, that Labour cannot take Muslim votes for granted and that this would help maybe generate pressure in the future on the Labour Party and its MPs in future decisions on Israel-Palestine conflict. However, I think there's a few problems with this. Firstly, the Muslim vote wasn't being presented as simply sending a message to the Labour Party, but rather that gaining MPs would mean a significant ability to affect legislation. And that's clearly not going to happen now. On this measure, it has been a failure. Secondly, the real message Labour Party got from this general election is that they can ignore the Muslim concerns over Palestine and still achieve a landslide victory of 411 MPs. Rather than Muslims sending a message to the Labour Party, Labour sent a message to Muslims. In a recent interview, Keir Starmer basically admitted that he could ignore the Muslims and their vote.
What about the issue with British Muslims? Trust is clearly broken down there. The election results show that. What are you going to do to try and rebuild it?
Well, we've got a strong mandate. Of course, where we didn't secure the votes, we'll address that. But I don't think there's any disputing the strength of the mandate that we have and that it's a mandate for change, for renewal and for politics as public service.
In fact, Keir Starmer is well aware that the Tories have had significant victories over the past 14 years by simply ignoring the Muslim vote. Even when the pro-Palestinian Jeremy Corbyn was leader, he was seen as a failure after losing 2 general elections. The irony being is that he actually won more votes but achieved less MPs than Keir Starmer. And again, that's because the way the British political system works. You see, power in Britain, and this is the case with all democratic capitalist societies, is not held by the people. Elections are bought and sold by the rich and the powerful of society. It's the rich billionaires that control the media, newspapers or television channels, including now also social media. Thus, they can control public opinion. It's the rich capitalist elites who fund political parties with millions of pounds in campaign contributions, or they have MPs as boards of directors on their multinational corporations. You have powerful interest groups that will pay millions over an election term to influence and gain access to government ministers. You see, a capitalist system is there to preserve the interest of a few under the ideological framework of liberal secularism. So if it were just about sending a message, there are other ways to do this. For instance, the mass protests we saw that suddenly stopped or slowed down as many pro-Palestinian activists were now busy with the election campaign. Peaceful actions that disrupt activities of companies engaged with Israel and helping them with their colonial activities, or the student protests that called for universities to stop dealing with Israel, in particular helping them with their military and security technologies, and even the boycott BDS movement has had significant impact and sent a significant message. Similarly, the use of social media in exposing the crimes of Israel, as well as the complicity of Western states in this crime, as well as counteracting the Hasbara propaganda being projected by Israel. All of this, like I'm saying, has sent a powerful message, and it's undermined the intellectual and moral justification for Zionism and the blind British support for Israel. Similarly, pro-Palestinian campaigners could have sent a powerful message by boycotting the elections. You see, governments in democratic societies use elections to rubber stamp their authority. By lowering the voter turnout, one can undermine the mandate of any government in charge. Even with Labour coming to power, we know it has one of the lowest mandates in British political history. This didn't stop it from gaining the vast majority of MPs, but if there was a concerted campaign, a real campaign to undermine the general elections, then this would have sent shockwaves through the British political establishment. This would have been the type of pressure that would have made the British political establishment rethink about its ongoing support for Israel. Without a high voter turnout, it leaves the system without a mandate and threatens the British political establishment's right to rule. Now, some may say this is just the first stage. Maybe in the next election, we can gain even more MPs. Well, there's a few problems with this strategy. Firstly, we saw, amongst others, former Labour members run as independent candidates in the same constituency. So one constituency had a number of pro-Palestinian candidates, thus causing splits in the vote. Now, some of them may have been sincere, believing they were the best independent candidate, and that's why there was a number of them running against each other. But there were also significant suspicions that these were former Labour and Lib Dem members, that they were working in an underhanded way to split the vote so that the Labour candidate or even Liberal Democrat candidate can win the vote. Secondly, in 5 years' time, will the same level of pro-Palestinian sentiment exist within wider society and the Muslim community? What if there is a ceasefire? What if the news has simply moved on in 5 years' time, even though Palestine would still remain occupied? As we know, before October 7th, Palestine and Gaza was barely in the news. And so in 5 years' time, the landscape or concerns many have may have moved on, and the appetite to punish Labour Party may no longer be there amongst the wider society, and particularly within the Muslim community. Will we therefore see business as usual, people returning back to the mainstream again? Thirdly, what type of message are pro-Palestinian independent MPs, many of whom are from a Muslim background, actually going to present? Could they, for instance, argue against the continued existence of an ethno-racial supremacist state of Israel? I don't think so. They'll be probably labelled anti-Semite and kicked out of parliament if they did. Could they argue for unity of the Muslim world and that the Sharia for the Muslim lands is the best law for the region? Of course they can't argue any of these points, because operating within a secular political system as that of Britain means you have to abide by the conventions and rules set by that system. That's why all of these independent MPs had to swear or affirm their allegiance to the King of Britain and serve him and his heirs.
And truly declare and affirm that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to His Majesty King Charles, his heirs and successors, according to law.
I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to His Majesty King Charles, his heirs and successors, according to the law.
I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to His Majesty King Charles, his heirs and successors, according to the law.
I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to His Majesty King Charles, his heirs and successors, according to law.
You see, this is the problem. Gaza or Palestine isn't going to be solved through the British political system. Remember, the British caused the problem in the first place. Really, the solution is not through more Western interference in the region, but really it's going to have to come from the Muslims in the region itself. Now, I know some are going to argue and say this isn't about solving Palestine, but sending a message that denounces Zionism, and maybe it gives space for the Muslims in the Muslim world to enact a just and long-term solution in the region. And I can acknowledge that a message was certainly sent by the Muslims, and to some extent it was successful in showing that Muslims are able to flex their political muscle in some seats. But the message will always be wrapped around a secular nationalistic message. This is the problem. Think about this. While some Muslims in the UK busy themselves in election fever, they consciously stayed away from discussing Sharia, Muslim unity, Khilafah in the Muslim world as a solution to the problem. While we have research published in the medical journal Lancet claiming that potentially 186,000 people have been killed in Gaza, then where are the conversations about demanding that the Muslim army should intervene? To be frank, you can't have these conversations, because as soon as we talk about Muslim armies having the right to intervene in Palestine or unifying the Muslim world into the Khilafah, then you may as well kiss your political aspirations to being an MP goodbye. Because if you want to operate within a secular liberal capitalist society, then you have to play by their rules. And going outside of that could mean you'll be excluded from the political system, accused of extremism, and even being potentially labelled with the T word. Now, again, I can imagine some saying, yes, but you are dreaming about Muslim unity, Khilafah, or Muslim armies intervening. Look, that's a big topic, but there's two things that needs to be clear. Expecting 5 independent MPs to change the course of pro-Zionist British government that's lasted for over 100 years is unrealistic. And secondly, Palestine is really a symptom of a deeper problem. Disunity of the Muslim lands, states that were originally created by the West, Muslim leadership that would rather support Zionism than practically support the Palestinians facing a genocide, and a world order that's shaped by Western liberal capitalist system. We need to break this world order and not just simply appeal to it to try to get it to maybe help solve the situation. So yes, the Muslim vote was to a certain extent significant, and I don't want to downplay that. But to be honest, to think that this will practically lead to helping Palestinians and the Muslim world is not just unrealistic, it also reinforces the problems we are facing. What's been significant over the past few months has been the ability to counter the Zionist propaganda, exposing the crimes of Israel, the protests, and even the boycotts that have taken place across the world. And as I mentioned, if people, including Muslims, protested against the elections by disengaging from it, then all of this would have sent a significant message to the British establishment, who are desperate to use elections as a way to rubber stamp their policies, in this case pro-Zionist policies. Destroy the intellectual and moral underpinnings of their pro-Zionist policies is a better way, a more significant way to change government policy in the UK. As for the Muslim world, we have an opportunity to call out and expose the Muslim rulers for their lack of action and, to be quite frank, their pro-Zionist agenda. That means also talking about and explaining what the Sharia is, what the Khilafah is, and the Muslim unity as an alternative to the current Western-dominated global order that, to be quite frank, has created the very problem we are currently seeing in Palestine. So although I commend Muslims from abandoning Labour and abandoning the pro-Zionist MPs, we need to be realistic and serious about real political change and avoid the distractions that these elections have brought, and avoid our Islamic voice being curtailed from within the secular system, fearing that we cannot talk about Islam and Islamic solutions because it would mean the end to entering the parliamentary democratic system. We need to stand proud on our Islamic voice and not curtail it just because we're trying to seek political position.